With your death, this nightmare may finally end. Skin you alive! I'm first.
Just die before you start teleporting. Oh my god, bro. Oh, Lord help me, I love you. Easy build. Let's go. Fuck yeah. Hey guys, it's Koga here again. Before going into the gist of the video, I want to ask you guys a very quick question. In the comments down below, let me know if this video is too long or if this video is too short. I don't want to make videos too long if you guys don't need all that information. I also want to make the videos too short because you guys are probably going to miss out on information you actually require to make the build. For this very reason, this can help me make content in the future, so thank you very much for answering. On top of that, I do stream on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at twitch.tv/Kogaras or Kogaris, however you want to say my name. I don't really mind either way. So it's a perfect place for you guys to hang out, interact, and ask me any questions about the build on the spot, instead of having to go into my YouTube and comment down below and wait for like a 24-hour period for me to respond. If it sounds really cool to you, then you're more than welcome to come and join and have some fun. So now that we're done with that, let's get into the montage.
I don't listen to the haters, man, I treat them like the enemy. Had a couple traitors, man, but now they know the penalty. I tell them, see you later, fam, I do not need this jealousy. I got no time for failure, man, I wanna leave a legacy. I lock in and I'm sold out, pop up for the whole crowd. I got this, I roll out, I promise, have no doubt. I'm all in, here I go now, call in, you all out. Take hostage, the pros now, they novice when I throw down. We gon' make it all the way. We don't care what they all will say. Don't listen to the hate, no. Listen to my fate, yo. Destined to be great, yo. And we gon' make it all the way. We don't care what they all will say. Don't listen to the hate, no. Listen to my fate, yo. Yeah, we like to go. Put me on ESPN, yeah. Put me on top of the tank, yeah. Pilots again and again, yeah. No, I ain't here to make friends, yeah. Taking it straight to the bank, yeah. I'm like a shark in a tank, yeah. And if your girl misbehave, yeah, I'll give your girl like a spank, yeah. That's making me out of my head, yeah. I don't belong in my bed, yeah. I should be famous instead, yeah. I will not stop till I'm dead, yeah. Never let them hate, tell them I'll be great. It's gotta be my fate, you can take it to the bank. I just wanna get it while I can, and when I get it, I'll be damned if I'ma let it get away. Without a fight, I got a plan, yeah. We gon' make it all the way. We don't care what they all will say. Don't listen to the hate, no. Listen to my fate, yo. Destined to be great, yo. Yeah. And we gon' make it all the way. We don't care what they all will say. Don't listen to the hate, no. Listen to my fate, yo. Yeah, we like to go hard.
Yo, even the bestiary monsters are...
I got it. I got it. By itself. Oh. Fuck. Oh, shit. Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed what you saw. The build's a lot of fun, but I want to talk about what defines the build and what allows everything to be completely possible. I want to talk about the passive skill tree here before moving on into the gear, because a lot of the things in the skill tree allows us to pick up the stuff we did for our gear. So, for this very reason, I want to talk about the notables and the things that make up this build. So first thing is we are a Deadeye. So we're on the bottom right side of the tree, which means our primary source of defense is evasion. And for this specific reason, I do not recommend this build for hardcore. Evasion is not a mitigated source of defense, essentially meaning it does not reduce the damage that you take. You either take the hits or you don't. And since you can't really max out your evasion at 100%, I do not recommend this, because if a one-shot kill happens to hit you because RNG did not bless you today, you will die, and that is that for your character in hardcore. This character is mostly meant for softcore, for fast running, a lot of money making, and for boss killing very, very quickly. Thus, if that sounds up to your thing, welcome to the video, and here is the passive skill tree. So the few notables I want to talk about is this build does take Vaal Pact. Now, Vaal Pact is something that allows you to essentially double the life leech you get per second, allowing you to face tank a lot of things in the game. Now, I wouldn't say face tank as you take the hit, but allows you to take degens on the spot because you can regen it very, very quickly. So it's kind of up and down, and you really never die. Now, The reason why I decided to take this is because this build only has a whopping 1.6 here and another a whopping 1% life regen in Heart of Oak for a whopping 2.6% regen. That is not worth keeping, so it's better to take the trade-off to Vow Pact and you have no life regen, but you have a lot more life leech. It's awesome for the build. Another thing that we do take is Point Blank. Now, Point Blank allows your projectiles to deal 30% more damage at the start of their movement, essentially meaning when you're really close to the enemy, but you deal 30% less damage when you're further away. In terms of PoE units, that is 75 units of distance away. I will clarify this when we go over the Deadeye real quick. On top of that, we are taking Acrobatics and Phase Acro. As you guys can see here, my evasion is roughly about 68%, mainly due to the 10% chance to blind on enemies on crit from this Claw Notable. This Claw Notable allows us to essentially blind their enemies, reducing their accuracy by 50%, which is awesome on terms of adding to our dodge chance and our spell dodge. Now, I want to make something very clear to you guys. Evasion and dodge are not the same thing, even though they effectively do the same thing. So to be very specific, evasion is entropy based, and what that means is it is affected by the monster's accuracy. And since we have a 10% chance to blind enemies on hit due to the claw node that we get from Lionized Fall Jewel, we do lower the enemy's accuracy by 50%, which roughly increases our evasion from 40% to 70%. It's a 30% increase effectively, which is very good. But that means that accuracy does not affect the dodge. Just because the monster is blinded does not mean that the dodge will go from 30% to 60 or whatever the hell it is. So the way it works is, let's say a monster hits you, it rolls a dice, let's say a 1 to 10, essentially. And since we have if it rolls a 1 through 7, we dodge. If it rolls a 8, 9, or 10, we get hit. Let's say the monster is lucky and you're not. RNG did not bless you today. They roll an 8 and you effectively should get hit. But wait a minute, we still have dodge. So now, since dodge is roughly about 40%, if it rolls a 1 through 4, it gets basically 2 dice now. A 1 through 4, you will dodge. If it rolls a 5 to 10, you will get hit. So essentially what that means is the monster has to go through 2 dice rolls, or essentially 2 layers of defense before it can hit you. It does not additively affect each other. So if you have 40% chance to evade and a 30% chance to dodge, it does not mean that you have a 70% chance to dodge, aka evade, whatever the hell you want to call it, it's combined, the monster. I hope that makes something very clear to you guys, the way that evasion and dodge works, and I hope it was very helpful. So I hope that helps you guys understand a bit more of why evasion and dodge is separately different. As you guys can see here, my evade chance is 68%, but my attack and spell dodge are separate at 45% for attack dodge and 30% for spell dodge. They are completely separate things and they do not affect each other. So now that it's taken care of, I want to go over the progression of the tree as you level up. So the first thing you guys want to pick up is these life nodes. Now you may ask yourself, why not pick up these projectile damage nodes if they do benefit us? The main reason is we get plenty of damage already from our gear in the tree, and thus this is not really needed as it's not efficient enough for us to take. These 5 points can be put on somewhere else where they give us more damage. But life is something that is very valuable in the build and kind of lacking, so these life nodes are much better to take. So that's what we do, we pick up these life nodes. Now you want to pick up here, pick up Heart of Oak as soon as you can. It gives you a little bit of movement speed here, some life and some life regen. Then I suggest going straight for Herbalism because it's straight up life. Then come down and try to get Point Blank as soon as possible. It essentially is 30% more damage free of charge. You just have to be closer to your enemies, and early on in the game it's not really that big of a deal because you have plenty of defense to take care of it. Right on the way there, you can pick up this skin. It's 2 points and you get a lot of life, a total of 14% life for only 2 points. Very efficient. You can pick up Farsight because it's in the way, so it might as well. Now from here on out, I do not recommend picking any of this side up on the bottom left until later. From here on, from Herbalism, come back down and pick up Lethality and pick up Primeval Force for all that elemental damage and bow crit and fizz damage. Now at this point, you most likely will be using Galvanic Arrow or Ice Shot for clear speed early on in the game as you level up. And these skills are converting a little bit of your damage elemental, since elemental damage is benefiting us as well as this little bit of crit. Now keep in mind that if you can also wait until you have a Depth's Harp at level 32, which has a decent amount of crit chance before picking up any of the crit nodes on the tree, but that's up to you. They still give fizz damage, so might as well pick it up. Then on your way up, you're going to pick up the King of the Hill and Master Fletcher. They're amazing nodes, a lot of fizz damage, attack speed, and crit chance, so might as well pick them up. Now this is on the same topic. This is crit chance only, so might as well pick this up once you have a Death's Harp at level 32. So skip it for now until you have that bow. Then, as you already talked about, we do take acrobatics. I recommend picking up phase acrobatics later on in the game because we don't really need that much dodge chance early. So it's more important to pick up the life and the damage than to pick up phase acro. Later on in the game, when stuff really starts to chunk you, then you can go ahead and pick up phase acro. I say around yellow tier maps, so roughly it's level 70 and higher. As you guys can see here, we have Lionized Fall Viridian Jewel. Now, this jewel is amazing because it allows us to transform any melee and melee weapon type modifiers into bow modifiers. So that means because of his large radius, these claw nodes over here and this dagger node over here allows us to take them because they now affect bows. So all this crit chance, crit multi, life leech, and life recovery rate, which does help us with Val Pact, which is absolutely amazing. Good synergy there. And on top of that, this fizz damage and attack speed from daggers and a little bit of chance to get in phasing does affect us, so it's really, really good. If you do not have this jewel, you are missing out on that chance to blind. And the only way for you to get this is from a jewel, which I'll speak about later in the gear choices, but it's very, very efficient, so please get this jewel if you can. For your convenience, I've added in the description below another POB of the build without the jewel, and it's basically a budget version. It is not needed. Essentially what would happen is you would drop all these nodes and pick them up somewhere else, but essentially this life leech will then be picked up right below Val Pact right here. And then of course you would also drop these dagger nodes. So do not pick up any of these nodes unless you have this jewel socket for Viridian Jewel, and also do not pick up this jewel socket at all because it's 3 points and it's not really worthwhile unless you have this jewel. Moving on, go left, pick up the life, Revenge of the Hunted, and this sweet
penetration
from Force of Nature, and a bit of Wed. They come up, pick up Fangs of the Viper for the movement speed and fizz damage, attack speed here, life, crit chance, and then this life node right here. That essentially is that. Once you have a good amount of leech, you can come down here, pick up Val Pact, pick up the projectile, and Art of the Gladiator, life, and life. Now these jewel sockets, you can pick them once you have the jewel sockets I will speak about in the gear section. The jewels can be very versatile, but I think that's better off for the gear section, so let's move on. As you guys already know, we are a Deadeye. Now Deadeye is amazing because it gives us everything we need for this build to function smoothly while giving us a lot of damage and a bit of defense. So the first thing I want you guys to pick up is Gathering Winds. This is amazing for early on. It gives us 1000 evasion while you have Tailwind, which means you have Tailwind once you use a skill. It can literally be anything, including Blood Rage, which has literally no animation. You press it and it's cast instantly. That will also give you Blood Rage. It will give us Tailwind. Now, Tailwind early on gives us 1000 evasion. Early on in the game, 1000 evasion is a lot of evasion, so your evade chance is going to be through the roof. Later on, it drops off as you level up, but it's still really, really good as we are stacking evade chance. On top of that, the effect of Tailwinds increases our action speed, which is completely different. It's kind of a more multiplier to your already other speeds, including movement speed, totem placement speed, which is kind of unique. A lot of people don't know about that, and your attack speed and cast speed. So it increases everything from your attack rate to your movement speed. So essentially increases your clear speed. And that's why I recommend this early on in the game, because you can go through the axe as quick as possible. Now here's the cool thing. A lot of people ignore Far Shot, but Far Shot's interesting because the way that Far Shot works is that you deal essentially 30% more damage while you are far range. This kind of counteracts, not kind of, it does counteract the negative side of point blank, which is amazing because since the build requires you to be close range, if you fight something that's kind of rippy, you want to move away in order to recollect yourself, pop in any flask, and not take any more damage. And in these situations, you don't want to be hampered by the fact that you have 30% less damage from point blank. So this is how it works. Here's a little line chart. At 0 units of distance, point blank gives you 30% more damage and Far Shot does nothing. At 35 units of distance, you're essentially medium range, and point blank gives you no damage benefit and no damage drop off. So you're essentially doing your neutral damage is what I'm gonna call it. On top of that, Far Shot's also doing nothing. So you're essentially doing your normal damage. Now let's move on to 75 units of distance. You're considered far away. Point blank here will reduce your damage by 30% less, which is a massive reduced damage. But Far Shot is going to give you 30% more. These two, 30% minus plus 30% more, will actually offset each other, making your damage essentially back to neutral. So you essentially have no downside if you happen to have to go back and shoot from far away in order to live, which is very, very good for the build. So don't underestimate this node. This is really, really good. On top of that, for those people who want to play Galvanic Arrow, 30% increased projectile speed is a massive amount of AoE. Third, I would recommend picking up Ricochet. Now, Ricochet is a skill that allows your, or a notable that allows your skills to chain. This increases your clear speed massively, so I recommend picking it up so you can just move around through the maps and through the leveling phase much quicker. Now, keep a note here, the projectiles deal 10% more damage for each remaining chain. This does not affect Blast Rain because Blast Rain cannot chain. So, as you guys can see here, 4 million, this does not affect us, so keep that in mind. Even though it's only 10%, it's a 10%, which is massive. Unfortunately, it will not affect Blast Rain. So, once that's done, moving on, we also take Endless Munitions. This is probably the last thing you can pick up as it's purely damage. It's not really required until later. 200 accuracy is amazing because we did drop Fast and Deadly, which gives us 50% more global accuracy rating. This will cap out your accuracy without any effort. Since we dropped this, I decided that, well, I already decided we are picking up Endless Munitions anyway, but the 200 accuracy is just more valuable now because we actually need it in the build. Don't worry, we still have a 100% chance to hit. It just so happens that picking up Ricochet over Fast and Deadly was the better option. On top of that, we get a massive amount of AoE, so no matter if you're playing Ice Shot or Galvanic Arrow, this is amazing. And you get the amazing skills fire an additional projectile, which allows us to scale our Blast Rain to infinite potential. So, I hope that helps you guys understand a little bit of the character and how I made it. So now, let's move on. It's now time to go over the gear choices I made for the build. Everything was chosen for a reason, to complement and synchronize our passive skill tree, but also to allow the build to perform at its best potential. I'll be informing you guys the item I picked and the price I paid for it just for your knowledge, while also giving you alternative options if the item is very expensive, just to give you a budget version for your convenience. However, keep in mind that prices in PoE change very rapidly and are dependent on the market demand of these items. For this very reason, I'm going to refrain from giving you the item's actual value as its current date, because the item's value in this video will not be accurate when the item changes value in the future. To refrain from giving you misinformation, this is what I will be doing. I'll be giving you guys price ranges, 4 to be exact, of where this item falls in between. I'm going to use a method that is mostly used across all content creators as to not confuse you. The 4 price categories are budgets 1 to 20 chaos, moderate 21 to 100 chaos, expensive 101 chaos and above, and then there's also flexible, where this item can basically fall anywhere in between depending how much money and how high of a stats that you guys want to buy from. Let's first start with our weapon of choice. The weapon I recommend for you guys to pick up is called Chinso Assassin Bow. This bow easily falls into the cheap category, easily 1 chaos if you buy it non-linked, and it's an amazing bow to start out with. With a decent amount of physical DPS, roughly sitting between 280 and 300, it gives us 50% more bow damage while at close range. This complements the fact that we take point blank, which gives us 30% more bow damage while at close range as well, for a whopping total of 80%. This is a humongous chunk of damage, and with the bow sitting easily into the cheap range, it is very, very good. You can easily get a 6 link for about 2 to 3 exalts. I think they're roughly going around for 3 and 3.5 because the prices have gone up recently. So a 6 link will obviously fall into the expensive category, but for a 6 link, it's very, very cheap. Alternatively, you can also pick up a bow called the Arborix. The Arborix is very unique because not only does it give us 30% more bow damage, it also gives us 2 additional arrows, which benefits highly with Blast Rain, as it now scales with additional arrows. However, even though the item technically does give us very slightly more damage, it is only more damage while we have Iron Reflexes. So it requires you either have Iron Reflex up all the time, which is not very good as we take acrobatics and reduces our armor, or we have to deal with the fact that we will not have 30% more bow damage half of the time, as the other half will have 30% more movement speed and attack speed. If you're okay with that sort of trade-off, you can go for it. I decided against it because of its low attack speed, sitting at 1.25, while Chinso has a really good attack speed at 1.43 at the maximum roll. The Arborix easily falls into the moderate category, with a 6 link also costing into the expensive category. For you guys' knowledge, there's also an item called the Jeweler's Touch. It's specifically a prophecy that allows you to use a Jeweler's Orb on an item and instantly make it a 5 link. Keep in mind, it's only a 5 socket 5 link, so you are missing a socket if you decide to use this method. However, this prophecy is very, very cheap, sitting into the cheap to moderate price category. So if you guys decide to 5 link it, you can easily buy a Chinso for 1 chaos and then use the prophecy and 5 link it for another 15 to 20 chaos. Easy life. Moving on to our quiver, the quiver that I decided to pick is called the Signal Fire Arrow Quiver. This quiver is amazing because not only does it give us 50% of physical damage converted to fire, it also gives us a humongous chunk of physical damage as extra fire damage that rolls between 25% to 35% depending on what you get. Now 50% of physical damage converted to fire damage is not that big of a deal since Blast Rain already covers 100% of it, but Galvanic Arrow and Ice Shot only cover about half of that. So the other half is converted to fire damage, which is really good and allows us to use ignited modifiers such as Immolate and other things on our gloves, which I'll speak about further. So that is very good. On top of that, it gives us a decent amount of attack speed, which is really good, and the Signifier actually falls into the cheap category. Now, I do not recommend for you to buy a Signifier flat out. What I recommend you to do is get a Black Gleam, which you can use from level 22, and then buy a prophecy called Fire and Brimstone. It easily falls into the cheap category as well, and the Black Gleam only costs about 1 alch as it's a very common unique and is used for leveling. Then after that, go to Act 3, go to the Crematorium, and you're going to fight a unique big golem, fire golem to be exact, kill him, and then boom, you have your Signal Fire, easy leveling. After that, it essentially is your endgame quiver. Now for alternative options for the quiver, there really isn't much to compete with. This item is already really cheap, and there's no reason to spend more when it's actually the best thing for the build. The only thing I can recommend to you is for people who have a lot of money is to get a corruption with 1 additional arrow, as it will add additional arrow to Blast Rain and is roughly about a 10% increase in damage, which is absolutely massive when our damage is hitting above 4 million. This seat's really expensive, easily into the expensive category, so if you have the money, go for it. Otherwise, good luck to corrupting all those quivers. Moving on to our body armor, there's many options available to you and is a very flexible gear choice. My recommendation to you is to use a Calm's Heart Glorious Plate. Calm's Heart provides you a massive 500 flat life and about a bit of fire damage ranging from 30 to 40% increased fire damage. This fits perfectly into the build as archers have a hard time getting a lot of life. At the same time, Blast Rain's main source of damage is fire damage. Thus, Calm's Heart fits the build perfectly. Using a Calm's Heart, the build easily hits around 6,000 life if you guys decide to anoint a life node on the tree. The only downside to using a Calm's Heart is the fact that it sits into the moderate to the expensive price category and that it has absolutely no sockets. I paid around 80C for the one you see in front of you. Now disclaimer, you may ask yourself, if Calm's Heart has no sockets, how was I able to use a Blast Rain and Ice Shot in the gameplay montage you saw earlier? Well, disclaimer, I decided to use 2 Chin Souls and 2 Signifiers in the build and just use a weapon swap between both of them. The weapon and quiver are both incredibly budget friendly, so I thought this was a very obvious choice to allow us to have more fun. However, Blast Rain by itself can clear and do single target easily, as I explain later in the gem link setup. But for your information, I wanted to inform you now of why I decided to choose Calm's Heart. Now for an alternative version, there is Belly of the Beast, giving us around 30% increased maximum life all the way to 40 and a bit of armor evasion and around 10 to 15 to all resistances. Now a Belly of the Beast sits easily into the cheap and moderate price category, or if you want to decide to 5-link or 6-link it, it falls between the moderate and the expensive category if you decide to 6-link it completely. Now if you guys decide to use a Belly of the Beast, I recommend keeping the artillery totems I decided to take out with Calm's Heart and keeping the weapon swap. However, that's entirely up to you. If you guys want to use one of the skills, like let's say Ice Shot for clear into your Belly of the Beast, and then just keep your Blast Rain on your bow, that is also an option. Now, another option to you that is very surprising is the Ashrend Buckskin Tunic. It's actually a very, how would I say, leveling friendly unique that's right now sitting very cheap for a 6-link. You can get a 6-link Ashrend into the cheap and moderate price category and just roll through the game. The only downside being that it has low life, but in return, it does give you a lot of damage with 13% increased physical damage with ranged weapons, scaling between 10 and 15, and also giving you socketed gems are supported by level 10 added fire. This is amazing as our build mainly does fire damage. Moving on to our helmet, which is another very flexible option, I just recommend you picking up a rare with as much life as possible, ranging from 80 plus and higher, and as much res as you guys require. The reason for this is because this build actually is resistance starved, as we're trying to get as much damage as possible into our jewelry. Another option you guys can pick from is Starconjas. Starconjas provide increased attack speed, a bit of crit chance, and a whopping over 90 to 100 increased maximum life with a lot of evasion. They fit very well into the build and they both fall into the cheap category. The only downside of Starconjas is the fact that it actually has no resistances, and that's why I decided against it. If you guys want to spend a bit more currency on your helmet, then my recommendation to you, and probably the best option for the build to min-max it, is a rare helmet with as much life and resistances as possible, with the unique delve modifier that allows nearby enemies to have -9 to their fire resistances. This is actually absolutely amazing because a lot of bosses nowadays have a lot of resistances, and the build could use all the
penetration it could get.
This easily falls into the moderate and expensive category if you decide to buy one. My recommendation to you is to actually use a Scorch Fossil to craft this. The best way is to get a 2-socket Resonator, use a Pristine Fossil that increases the likelihood of getting a life roll, and a Scorch Fossil which increases the likelihood of getting that nearby -9 fire resistances. And it's actually the only way for you to get it. These fossils are actually relatively cheap, so at the end of the day, it's up to your RNG in order for you to get it as cheap as possible. Unfortunately for me, I never got it, so that's why you don't see it on this helmet. But hey, it's not required, it's just an option for you to get a lot more damage. For enchantments, I recommend picking up Blast Rain Fire as an additional arrow. Now that Blast Rain skills with additional arrows, this is a massive damage increase, roughly equaling about 10% of your damage. Now these can actually fall into between the moderate and the expensive category depending on the base. It easily falls into the expensive category if you decide to choose a Star Conjure. For this very reason, I decided to pick a normal base with the fire's additional arrow and then craft it myself using the fossils I described earlier. This will allow you to get the best option for the build, as a delve helmet with the nearby enemies actually out DPSs our Star Conjure and actually gives you some better res, life, and damage, which is in my opinion better than having a Star Conjure all around. Otherwise, you can get Blast Rain, deals 40% increased damage, also in the moderate category, but it's actually less damage than the fire's additional arrow, but it's there if you happen to get it. However, I do not recommend you guys buying a helmet with the Blast Rain deals 40% increased damage, as I don't want you guys to invest your money into crafting a helmet with this mod when the mod fires an additional arrow is actually better, and at the end of the day, you might need to upgrade to it anyway. But if you happen to get it for cheap, I see no reason why you couldn't use it. Another option you guys can pick from is Blast Rain has 24% increased area of effect. It can probably fall into the cheap and moderate price range, and it's only really recommended if you guys decide to use Blast Rain for your clear and your single target setup. Moving on to our glove slot, which is another very flexible gear option. I recommend picking up the gloves you guys see right in front of you. Now these gloves are very unique because they have the unique incursion modifier that allows you to have added fire damage against burning enemies. Since we are using Blast Rain, which is a very fire skill, and even Signal Fire, which converts half our damage to physical, so even Ice Shot and Galvanic Arrow, which are not essentially fire skills, are igniting and burning enemies, which means this is a very good chunk of added damage. Now, as it might not seem, but these gloves actually sit easily into the modded category. I paid around roughly 30 chaos for the ones you see in front of you. Now, not only is that mod really good, it also comes with a tier 1 fire resistance roll, which saves up a lot of other resistances and other gear options like our jewelry, which can be very expensive if you guys want a lot of damage, and our belt. But before moving on to those, the primary sources of mods you guys want to look for is life and the resistances you need, physical damage to attacks, attack speed, and of course the unique incursion modifier if you can pick it. If you want something closer to the cheap's option, just look for the life and the unique incursion modifier and just avoid the fizz damage and the attack speed, but try to look for at least an open suffix so you can craft the attack speed yourself. If you want the more expensive version of these gloves, then essentially look no further than the gripped gloves. These gloves have a unique implicit giving you about 15 to 20% increased projectile attack damage, and since Blast Range essentially is a projectile skill, this is very good for the build. However, these gloves can be incredibly expensive, especially if you're looking for the mods you see here on the gloves that I currently wear. For this very reason, I don't recommend it, as 15 to 20% increased attack damage is probably not worth the money you're going to need to buy these gloves. Another alternative is to use Tomb Fist. Now, Tomb Fist is very unique as it allows you to have Intimidate, is if you use a Murderous Eye Jewel in the Abyssal socket. Now, Intimidate is a very good source of damage, as it allows enemies to take 15% increased attack damage, which essentially is a more damage modifier. Now, Tomb Fist easily falls into the cheap category if you only choose one Abyssal socket, but can fall easily into the expensive category if you decide to pick up two. My recommendation is to only pick up one, as we're only really looking for the Intimidate. The only downside to using a Tomb Fist, other than the fact that it only has 6% increased life, it has no attack speed, is the fact that you actually have to buy a decent Murderous Eye Jewel in order for it to really be very, very good. Other than that, you can also pick up normal rare gloves, like let's say Sync gloves, with fizz damage, life, res, and attack speed. These are basically the most cheapest options, but also give out the least amount of damage. If you want to spend even more money on the glove setup, then there are a few corruptions you can actually pick. The recommendations are increase max sum life and attacks have 0.5 to 0.8 increased critical strike chance. Now don't be fooled, this increased critical strike chance actually affects your base crit of your weapon. So Chainsaw actually has a critical strike chance of 6.7, so add to that number, ranging from 7.2 to 7.5 increased crit chance. This is actually very good for the build. However, it can be quite expensive if you're looking for the unique incursion modifier on top of this corruption. There's nothing really else to recommend, as curse on hit gloves are not really recommended for the build, as we already have a curse in our helmet gem link, which I'll speak about later during the gem setup. So I don't recommend you guys actually spending more money on curse on hit gloves unless you guys decide to change the build and add an extra curse. Moving on to our boots, is basically a very simple option for the gear choice. Now here I would recommend picking up a rare with as much life and resistance as you need and movement speed. You can also try to get a little bit of chance to dodge attack and or spell hits. Now keep in mind the lifeblood of a bow character is as much movement speed as possible, because they don't have a spammable movement skill such as leap slam, warding blades, or shield charge. Since we have a blink arrow and it's on a cooldown, getting as much movement speed is actually equivalent to a defensive layer to your build. For this very reason, I would recommend trying to pick up boots with at least 30% movement speed or higher. I would almost prioritize that over the life and resistances in my opinion. If you want something that's more of a budget option, of course you can just drop the amount of life and resistances the pair of boots have. Also try to get as much evasion, as this of course is an evasion build. The ones you see in front of you, I paid around 30c. However, I think that's a really good price for what the boots are worth. They're much closer to around 80 to 100 chaos. However, this is a very flexible option, ranging from anywhere from cheap to expensive, depending on how much resistances and life you get. Moving on to boot enchantments, there's a lot of flexible options you guys have available to you, but I'm going to recommend you the ones I think are the strongest and the best for the build. Now, enchantments for boots can be very expensive, especially if you're trying to get the boots you're looking for with the enchantment you're also looking for. For this very reason, I will recommend that you guys actually go out of your way and go to the lab yourself to enchant them yourself. Otherwise, you'll be paying a lot of currency for something that's probably not as important. I really don't like the lag, so for this very reason, I don't have any enchantment in my boots, but it's there if you guys so choose so. Now, one of the options is having fire damage if you killed recently. That will also affect how fast you kill things. Essentially is a clear speed buff. Another one that's really good is increased attack and cast speed if you kill recently. Another very good movement speed buff, or more like clear speed buff. And then my favorite, and I will think the best for the build, is damage penetrates 10% of enemy elemental resistances if you haven't killed recently. Now this only works on bosses, essentially because you have not killed anything during that time period. Of course, you're fighting a very tanky boss, so nothing has died yet. For this very reason, it's super strong, as he basically is just an extra 10% pen, which is a massive damage boost. Otherwise, you can also go for 10% increased movement speed if you haven't been hit recently. This is up the majority of the times, as the build is pretty much only evasion, which is absolutely amazing. As I said before, movement speed is the lifeblood of a bow character. And then of course you have chance to dodge spell hits if you've taken spell damage recently, just to help a little bit of dodge. This is not really that important, but if you happen to get it, hey, it's there and it does something for the build, so no need to complain about those type of mods. Now it's about time we move on to our jewelry. The first thing I'm gonna cover is the belt, as it's a very simple gear choice, and I'm gonna recommend to you guys the two best bases. These two best bases are essentially the rustic sash and the Stygian vice. Now the rustic sash comes out very cheap, easily falling between the cheap and the moderate range, because it has increased physical damage as it's implicit. Now since this build does convert physical damage to elemental, physical damage still actually affects the build, which is still very good. Now while Stygian vice is the best in slot, they come at a price. They usually fall between the moderate and the expensive category. Reasons being, Stygian vice is just too freaking broken in my opinion, and they just overshadow every single other belt base. Simple being, a jewel has a lot more potential than just increased physical damage, unfortunately. Now the mod specifically, you're looking for a belt or as much life as possible. Try to aim for 90 or higher with as much res as possible, and then try to aim for an open prefix so you can craft elemental damage with attack skills. Since you can craft easily 30%, this is very good, and it would be the cheapest option available to you. I would do not recommend you buying a belt with elemental damage already rolled, as these can be much more expensive. Now, if you want a top of the line belt, I recommend using Delve Fossil Crafting. Now the fossils you guys want to use is a Prismatic for elemental damage, a Scorch Fossil for fire damage, and a Pristine to increase the chances of getting a life roll. You combine this in a 3-socket resonator, and boom, you have a potential of getting an OP Stygian Vise belt with plus 90 life, increased fire damage, increased elemental damage, and of course you can also craft increased elemental damage of attack skills for a whopping over about 60 to 80% increased damage. However, this does mean that you get less resistances on your belt, so keep in mind this is only available for people who want to throw money at the belt. For our ring selection, everything is essentially very flexible. The primary mods you guys are looking for are any stats you might require. These are most likely going to be strength and intelligence, physical damage to attacks, as much life as possible, resistances as you need them, and elemental damage of attack skills. There's also attack sweep, but it's a much rarer mod, but it's there if you so choose to get it. This diamond ring you guys see in front of you is actually very good, and I paid roughly about 30C for them, mainly because I needed the resistances and the int while getting some damage. However, there are alternatives that are unique for the build and are very strong and incredible to use. One recommendation is a Circle of Anguish ruby ring. Now these rings specifically give you damage while using a certain herald. The one I'm using is of course the Herald of Ash one because it gives us fire damage. Now, the other mod you want to specifically look for is Herald of Ash has 30% reduced mana reservation. This allows us to have more mana in the build and of course increase the level of precision. The reason for this is because we want to cap out our accuracy to 100%, and increasing the level of precision actually benefits this very much, so I recommend picking these two mods up. I paid roughly about 15 chaos, believe it or not, for this ring, and it actually ranges into the cheap and moderate category. However, it can get very expensive depending on the implicits you guys see here. The ones I have are 60% increased damage while leeching mana, which does give us mana as we're leeching mana all the time, and global increased accuracy rating. These are very good, so I believe I got lucky with this ring, but if you so choose to get life, increased maximum life is another mod, it can be very expensive, so it's up to you guys what you want to pay. So it can be very flexible, but for sure they'll be in the moderate category. Another option that's very viable for the build is picking up Mark of the Elder Steel Ring. Now this ring not only is a steel ring base, which is amazing because it gives us a lot of flat physical damage, and as this build is physical to elemental, is really good. It does give us a bit of cold damage, which is not really what we use, but it's still a bit of damage, so why not take it? Increase maximum life, and a lot of increased attack damage. However, you only get this insane amount of attack damage ranging from 60 to 80% if your other ring is a shaper item, meaning the other ring has to be a shaper influenced ring. The problem with this is that to look for a shaped ring with the mod you're looking for, specifically life, resistances, and int, while also getting damage can be very expensive. So for this very reason, I don't think the trade-off of spending more money for the other shaped ring is worth using the Mark of the Elder. In total, you will spend more money on trying to get a good shaped ring to use with the Mark of the Elder than you are going to pay for the actual Mark of the Elder yourself. However, it is a very viable option, but I would recommend the Circle of Anguish over the steel ring. If you have even deeper pockets, another very viable ring I could recommend to you guys is the Taming Prismatic Ring. It gives you guys a whopping 60 to over 100% increased damage depending how many elemental elements are present on an enemy at a given time. However, it does come with a few drawbacks. It sits easily into the expensive category, and on top of that, it's missing other stats that we require, such as life and attributes, specifically strength. That's why I recommend the Circle of Anguish Ruby Ring, as it does come with a little bit of fire resistances and a chunk of strength, which we will need to run our Calm's Hearts. But it is still an option for you guys to run, as it does give the most damage out of all the options we've given so far. For your amulets is another very flexible and simple option. The primary stats you guys are going to look for are your starved attributes, mainly strength and intelligence. Life ranging from between 60 and above is what I would recommend. Physical damage to attacks, global crit multi, and of course elemental damage of attack skills. There's also resistances if you guys require them. However, I do not recommend you guys buying an amulet with resistances, as the damage is much more valuable, and I recommend for you guys to look for those resistances elsewhere. I paid roughly about 20 chaos for the amulet you guys see right in front of you. Believe it or not, mods like this are very common on an amulet, so it's not too expensive. However, if you guys decide to spend more money, you can look for wet on top of this or resistances as you guys might need them. Otherwise, if you want to throw even more money and you're a big baller, then I recommend getting an amulet that has been influenced by one of the Conquerors or Shaper or Elder. Specifically, the mods you're looking for is any extra elemental as a portion of your physical damage, as this very greatly enhances the damage the build does. However, these are only better if you decide to get these amulets with physical damage and global crit multi on top of those very specific mods. Otherwise, it is not worth the investment you guys are going to spend. For your Amulets Anointments, I'm going to give you guys my recommendations and as well a little trick for you guys to use in PoB if you want to learn how to pick one yourself. Now the two nodes you guys can pick are essentially life nodes and damage nodes, but I recommend picking up a life nodes because they're much more valuable and it's already scarce in the tree as a ranger. While we get plenty of damage as it is, so it's not really needed, but it's there for your convenience. For the life nodes, I recommend Blood Siphon for an Azure, Opal, and Silver. It has a bit of strength. If you guys require that, then pick this one. It sits into the moderate category. There's Cool Preparation for Teal, Black, and Silver Oil, and it has a bit of res and the same amount of life. It falls into the moderate category as well. My pick was Discipline and Training, as it gives you the best life for the moderate category for 10% increased maximum life and 30 flat life. It gives you what you need for it is a black, silver, and silver oil. This is easily more expensive than the other two, but it's not as expensive as the big boy Constitution. This easily falls into the expensive category for silver, gold, and gold, and it gives you the most life. For damage, there's about 3 recommendations I can give you guys, and the reason for that is because it gives you that sweet
Penetration.
Now, penetration is very good in the build, as a lot of bosses have a lot of resistances, so the more penetration you get, the better it is for the build. Now, starting from cheap to expensive, the cheap category is Divine Judgment. It gives you a bit of penetration, elemental damage for Sapphire, Teal, and Black. Now, the best thing for the damage is Lava Lash. It is a very fire-specific node. It gives you the most amount of penetration and 30% increased elemental fire damage. However, it falls into the expensive category because you do need a gold. So the 3 oils you need for this one are clear, and gold. Unfortunately, that gold kind of screws you up. Now, another option I do not recommend, however, is Heart of Flame. Now, this actually gives you less damage than Lava Lash, but it's more expensive with a Teal, Azure, and a Golden. So this also falls into the expensive category. So if I have to pick between the two, do pick Lava Lash over Heart of Flame, but it is an option if you guys have these oils. Now for the trick you guys can use, going down to PoB, if you look for the search bar at the bottom of your screen, there's a thing called Show Node Power directly right of it. If you click that, it now highlights every single node in the tree that gives you the most DPS. They're essentially highlighted in red. The brighter the red, the more DPS it gives you. And essentially the method I use to guys for you guys to learn what node gives you the most amount of damage, and these are all the available ones. So if you decide to pick something else, go ahead and pick it. Now unfortunately, this doesn't really highlight the defensive nodes like yellow, life and let's say evasion. They're kind of highlighted in blue, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference between them. Luckily for us, life is easy to tell. The more life it gives you, of course, the more life you're gonna get. While damage can be very tricky, so it's good that this does the calculation for you, and that's what I recommend for you guys to do. Hope this helps you guys. Let's go on. Now it's time to talk about the jewels the build's going to be using. I previously scratched over this when I went over the passive skill tree and the gear section. However, I kind of held back in explaining these because jewels are very complex due to the vast amount of mods available to be rolled. With only a few I would actually recommend, and for this very reason I wanted to leave it for its own section. Since we just covered the gear section, I wanted to first go over the abyssal jewels, as they can be socketed into your Stygian Vise and your Tomb Fist if you decide to use those gloves. Now, abyssal jewels fall into the flexible category due to their vastly varying price, depending on whether the seller knows what it's worth or not. The ones I paid right in front of you are essentially what 30k, as I remember, is what I paid for it, and it falls into the moderate category. However, this can fall easily into the expensive category if you can't find one just like mine. But essentially, if you want something more budgets, look for less life, less damage, or just look for a 2-prop. The primary mods I would recommend are the attack speed and the life over the fizz. Now, if you want to throw even more money into your abyssal jewel, all you have to do is look for a 4-prop instead of a 3-prop with the mods mentioned before. Moving on to normal jewels, essentially the jewels you cannot socket into your gear and can only be socketed into your tree. There's almost too many mods to mention or even write into this video, so I'm going to give you my recommendations as to the one that gives you the most damage. Now, of course, the mod that you're going to prioritize is increased maximum life as the most valuable. Other than that, you're really looking for the most amount of global critical strike multiplier. There is increased global strike multiplier, there is multiplier with elemental and fire skills, and essentially those are the mods that are give you the most damage for the buck. However, these are very expensive, so a jewel with 2 multiplier rolls and increased maximum life easily falls into the expensive category. However, if you're looking for something more cheap, there is increased global physical damage, area effect damage, there's physical damage of bows, there is fire damage, and there's also other types of modifiers out there like increased attack speed of bows, but it gives less damage than the multiplier. However, I do not recommend you guys to buy a normal jewel, as the unique ones we're going to talk about now are much better for your buck. There's only really 3 unique jewels I'm going to recommend to you guys, and are the ones I personally use. Of course, the first one being Lionized Fall Viridian Jewel. This allows those crazy claw modifiers and dagger modifiers in a passive tree to become, in effect, bow modifiers. It's absolutely amazing, and this jewel alone gives us about 30% increased damage, which is absolutely massive. It falls into the moderate category. Other than that, there's of course the Watcher's Eye. Now, the Watcher's Eye is incredibly unique because not only does it give you increased maximum life, it also gives you a big buff depending on the aura you guys are using. Since the only aura we're really using is Precision and Anger, and Precision modifiers are very expensive, I recommend getting one that has affected by Anger. Now, the majority ones you're going to pick are Increased Critical Strike Multiplier with while affected by Anger. This is the one I chose as it gives you the most damage for the cheapest price, but it still falls between the moderate and the expensive category. There's also Damage Penetrates Fire Resistance while affected by Anger. This easily falls into the expensive category. And Physical Damage as extra fire damage while affected by Anger. This one's actually into the moderate category as well, but gives the least amount of damage, so I highly recommend the Crit Multi over that. There's also increased fire damage, but this one's actually the weakest one, and it still costs very expensive, so I do not recommend that one. Now, the reason why precision-based jewels are more expensive is mainly due to the fact that the precision aura is very easy to use, as it only requires mana rather than a percentage of your mana, and the fact that it is used vastly in almost all crit-based builds. The reason being, it gives you global critical strike chance, which affects attacks and spells. So not only are attack-based builds using it, of course, other spell-based builds are also using it. A lot of people leave it at level 1, so it's very easy to just buy a level 1 precision, pop it on, and then buy a Watcher's Eye. Now, because it's high demand, these jewels are very expensive, so they fall into the expensive category. But if you want to buy a Watcher's Eye precision jewel anyway, my recommendation to you is, of course, increase attack damage, increase critical strike multiplier, and increase attack speed while affected by precision. Now, if you want to go even more balls deep into the expensive category with a Watcher's Eye, then of course look for a double Anger or Anger and Precision, or a double Precision, of course, any sort of these combination mods together in one Watcher's Eye. These can be actually extraordinarily expensive, so I only recommend it for those big boys out there with huge wallets. Moving on to my last recommendation for the unique jewel is actually a very cheap jewel falling into the cheap category, and it's actually a requirement if you're going to use Comb's Heart. Now, if you paid attention or if you bought a Comb's Heart already, you know that it has a very high strength requirement, requiring your build to have 191 strength. This is very difficult for a ranger build, and for this very reason, I recommend the jewel Inertia. Inertia gives you a chunk of strength and then converts any dexterity in the radius around it into strength. So I recommend going into your passive skill tree, as you see here, and socketing it into this jewel. Now, the reason I say this jewel is because this jewel is actually the easiest jewel to get for only 2 points, and it gives a lot of dexterity, roughly equally about 60. So this jewel alone gives you about 80 to 90 strength, which is very good, and allows you to wear the Comb's Heart. The only drawback to this jewel is the fact that you lose accuracy from losing this dexterity node. So pay attention to your accuracy and make sure that it's always capped at 100%. The 2 ways to avoid this is, of course, hitting accuracy in your gear, or just do what I do, buy a Ring of Anguish, is why I recommended it, with the mod that lowers the reservation for Herald of Ash. Now that Herald of Ash requires less mana, you can now increase the mana reserved by Precision, essentially increasing the level of Precision, which now increases the amount of accuracy it gives you. With a level 15 Precision, you now have capture accuracy again at no cost. So that's what I recommend for the build, the Ring of Anguish. Now it's high time we talk about the Flask setup for the build. Now, Flasks are very tricky for the bow builds because there's so many options available to you guys, so it can be hard to pick the right one. So I'm going to do my best to give you guys my recommendations of which Flasks are the best for the build. Now, a little disclaimer for you guys. I'll be giving you the price category for the unique flasks, but I will not be doing the same for the magic and utility flasks. Reasoning being is these flasks in the market cost very expensive if you're looking for the specific mod you want, usually falling into the modder category, and it's much cheaper to just craft them yourself. Thus, for crafting, I recommend just picking up the bases while you level, in the quests, or buying it off a vendor, and then just using a transmute and an alteration orb to get the mod that you guys want. It's essentially what the majority of players use instead of buying them off the market at a very high price. Other than that, another very cool option, and is much cheaper to you guys, essentially is to use an alteration orb until you get just a prefix by itself, a prefix being reduced charges used, or extra charges, or even increased duration by itself, and then going to the menagerie and beast crafting the suffix. The suffix is usually the immunity, so immunity to poison, immunity to curse, immunity to freeze and bleed, And then essentially all you do is put the flask into the beast crafting area in the little slot, pick the one you want, and boom, now you have the perfect flask instead of having to roll through hundreds of alterations until you get the one you want. This essentially is the best option, and that's what I highly recommend. Now that's out of the way, let's go over the recommendations I'm gonna give you guys. Now, as I said before, the lifeblood of a bow build is movement speed. For this very reason, I highly recommend a Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline. Adrenaline is a modifier that gives increased movement speed during Flask effect, ranging from 20 to 30%. And with this and a Quicksilver Flask, you roughly get 60 to 70% increased movement speed in a push of a button, which is really good for clear speed and getting out of sticky situations. Now for the prefix, there's many options you have available to you guys. There's increased charge recovery, additional maximum charges, reduced charges used, or even increased effect and reduced duration. However, my recommendation is either reduced charges used or increased maximum charges. That way you have 3 usages instead of just 2. The second flask I highly recommend for you guys is of course a life flask. The reason being, we are a life build and we also take Vow Pact, so we have no life regen. So if there is no monster nearby to actually leech life, we have to find a way to recover our life back, and the easiest one to pick is of course a life flask. So if you're running a life build, always make sure to run at least one of these. Now, the only 2 flasks I recommend are a Divine and an Eternal Life Flask. The real difference between both of them is that an Eternal Life Flask recovers less life, but at a quicker rate, while Divine recovers more life, but at a slower rate. And the only suffix I recommend is of Staunching, or Immunity to Bleed. The reason behind this is incredibly simple, is if you have a bleed on you, or if you have Corrupting Blood, which is removed by the same Staunching mod, you are going to be losing life. So what other reason to not put in your life flask? Because most likely you're going to pop that life flask to get that life back. So once you're reducing your life due to the bleed, pop the flask, and now you recovered it back while also removing the debuff. It's a very simple and obvious pick. For your prefixes, all you're really looking for is either increased recovery rates or increased amounts recovered, but at a slower duration. This mod, of course, I only recommend it for the Eternal Life Flask, and it's a very cool combination. Since the Eternal Life Flask already has a quicker rate of recovery, but a lower amount recovered, this mod fits perfectly. Now with this mod in an Eternal Life Flask, you now have a higher amount of life recovered, but it does debuff your recovery rate, but since the flask already is so good, it's actually worth using. So now you have a large amount of life recovered at a decent rate. I hope that kind of makes sense for you guys. Moving on to your third flask slot, what I highly recommend to you guys is a Diamond Flask. Now what a Diamond Flask does is it effectively increases your chance to crit. Now when you read a Diamond Flask, you may ask yourself, what does your critical strike chance is lucky actually mean? So I'm going to do my best to explain to you because this mod is very unique. Now what this mod does essentially makes each individual hit roll twice to see if it actually crits. For example, let's say the game rolls a 10-sided dice to see if your hit is going to crit. If you have a 50% chance to crit, a 1 through 5 will make a hit crit, while a 6 to 10, it will not, right? So let's say that first hit rolled a 6, so it means it did not crit. But wait, if you have a Diamond Flask up, it will roll another dice, and if that second dice actually rolls a 1 through 5, then the hit will actually crit. It's like when you're a student and your teacher gives you 2 tries in the same exam and takes the better score out of both of them. And that's essentially what a Diamond Flask does. Now I hope that helped you guys understand how the Diamond Flask works and why it's so amazing. But now it's time to move into the unique flasks I recommend for the build. The first unique flask I'm gonna highly recommend to you guys is the Dying Sun Ruby Flask. Not only does it give you 50% increased fire resistance, but also makes you take 20% less fire damage. On top of that, its main unique modifier is that it gives you 2 additional projectiles during flask effects. Now that blast range kills of additional projectiles, this is absolutely massive, basically giving you 20% increased DPS. Also, it gives you increased area of effect ranging from 15 to 25, so no matter if you're playing Galvanic Arrow or Ice Shot, you're getting massive clear speed as well. The only downside is that it's a rare drop from Shaper himself, so it falls into the expensive category. However, quick note, if you do decide to buy this flask, please pay attention to the increased charges used. If you get the minus 10% roll or somewhere along those lines, you can get a Dying Sun that consumes 30 or less charges out of the 60, meaning you have 2 pops of this one flask. If you don't pay attention, you may buy one that has over 30 charges consumed, so you only get to use it once before having to kill something and refill it again. It is very important, so please look out for that. The last flask I highly recommend to you guys before moving on to the alternatives is the Wise Oak Bismuth Flask. At its base, the Business Flask gives you 35% to all elemental resistances, which is good if you're running a map with elemental weakness. Now the Wise Oak has a very wordy, I would say, mods, and it's very confusing to use, so I'm going to do my best to explain it to you guys. Now we all know that your elemental resistances are capped at 75%. However, your actual res can be higher. You can have 100 fire resistance, but defensively only take into account 75 when you take in fire damage. So that's what this flask actually looks for, is that overall resistance ignoring the actual cap. So let's take in mind, let's say you have 100 fire resistance, 79 cold, and 80 lightning. What this means is you will now penetrate fire resistance because it is your highest, and you take 10% reduced cold damage because that is technically is your lowest. But conversely, what that also means is if you somehow manage to make all three resistances exactly the same amount, you will actually take 10% reduced damage from all three and penetrate all three. This can be very expensive, so I don't really recommend it unless you have some money to throw in. All you really need to do is make your fire resistance the highest so you penetrate fire resistance. The flask is easily cheap to the moderate category depending on how high the resistance roll you get. It rolls from 10 to 15, with the 15 being the most expensive. Now let's move into the alternative flasks you guys can use for this build. The first one to talk about is the Atziri's Promise Amethyst Flask. Now this flask can go from cheap to moderate price depending on the rolls you guys get, but it's absolutely amazing because it gives you a lot of damage. As you guys can see here, it gives you a portion of your physical and elemental as extra chaos, and since this build converts physical to elemental, you actually benefit from both mods, giving you a pretty decent damage bonus. Alternatively, there is the Cinder Swallow Urn Silver Flask. Being a silver flask, it does give you Onslaught, which is awesome for clear speed. On top of that, enemies ignited by you during a flask effect take 10% increased damage, which is a more multiplier, and since our build is fire, we do ignite our enemies very often, which is absolutely amazing. Now, however, this flask does go between the cheap and the moderate expense category. Reason being, this flask has a veiled mod. Now, you have no control over this mod, so you have to look for the mod you want already veiled in the market. And the only mod that I recommend you guys to pick up is increased critical strike chance during flask effect. This one mod can be very expensive and will usually fall into the moderate category. With the gear out of the way, now it's time to talk about the gem links that make this build possible. Let's first start with Blast Rain. Blast Rain will be linked with Inspiration for that reduced mana cost, increased crit chance, and more elemental damage. Concentrated Effect for that incredible more area damage. Immolate for that added fire that's absolutely massive. Even though it has to be a burning enemy, we are igniting them very often due to the critical strike chance in the build. We also have elemental damage of attacks, which is a massive amount of more elemental damage, and then Combustion. Now, Combustion only adds 28% more fire damage. However, it has a unique modifier of enemies ignited by supported skills have minus 19 fire res, which essentially is 19% more
Penetration.
Now, as you guys may have noticed, I did not speak about elemental focus despite being a massive more multiplier to our elemental damage. Unfortunately, it comes with a big drawback. It negates any elemental elements from being inflicted with the gem link, and that's a problem because that means we cannot inflict any ignites, which negates the Combustion's debuff of minus 19 fire res and means we cannot use Immolate. It also destroys the incursion modifier we have in our gloves, giving us added fire. For this very reason, I do not recommend it in the build. Another thing you guys may have noticed is the fact that this is actually a 5 off-color setup. The bow that we're using is Chin Soul, and it only requires a decent amount of dexterity, which means the majority of your gems will be green. However, if you notice here, we have 3 blues and 2 reds and only 1 green. That is a problem in terms of currency because it will take a lot of chromatics for you guys to get 5 off colors on the bow. For this very reason, if you guys cannot afford it or you have trouble getting it, just please swap out Combustion with slower projectiles. Sure, we lose the minus 19 fire res, but we can put this Combustion anywhere else in the build, and I'll explain that later on in the other gem links. But for now, if you guys have that option, go ahead and just put slower projectiles instead of Combustion. For our second bow setup, this is basically almost the same thing as Blast Rain with a few different changes. We're going to be using Ice Shot in this setup, and it's linked to Inspiration, Immolate for the added damage, GMP mainly because Ice Shot does not give any additional projectile, so we have to simulate that with greater multiple projectiles so we can clear large packs in one hit, elemental damage of attacks, and then my 6th link of choice was Onslaught. Since we don't have Onslaught anywhere else in this build, I find it very nice to put it into the Ice Shot setup, so while you're clearing things with your Ice Shot, you're getting a chance to get Onslaught, which increases your clear speed. Works well using a clear speed skill with a clear speed gem. Now, I put this at the 6th link because Unfortunately, on higher tier maps, Ice Shot needs more damage than one-shot packs. However, if you feel like you have enough damage, go ahead and put Onslaught into your 4th link or 5th link and swap it out with something else. I recommend taking out Immolate or Inspiration instead if you want to use Onslaught as a more priority. Now, if you want to be loyal to Galvanic Arrow instead of Ice Shot, all you really have to do is swap out Ice Shot for Galvanic Arrow and GMP for faster projectiles. GMP is not needed because Galvanic Arrow already adds additional projectiles, and then faster projectiles actually increases the AoE of Galvanic Arrow. And there you go, now you're running Galvanic Arrow for clear speed and you're good to go. On a separate 4-link setup, we have Herald of Ash, which gives us 15% of our physical damage as extra fire, which is an absolute massive amount of damage for just a 25% mana reserved. It also allows us to get the Ruby Ring, Ring of Anguish, which gives us fire damage while affected by Herald of Ash. Awesome setup, I highly recommend it. It also allows us to blow up packs in one shot and create those big sploose explosions, which I highly recommend for the aesthetics and fun. Next to that, we have Anger for that flat fire damage, which is really good for the build, as our majority of our damage is of course fire. Now this allows us also to pick up the Watcher's Eye while being affected by Anger. We also have Precision for that increased amount of accuracy and Global Critical Strike chance. This allows us to basically cap out our accuracy and have a 100% chance to hit. I highly recommend to leave this at level 15, but only if you have the Ruby Ring, which reduces the mana reserved of Herald of Ash. And then for our last 4 slot, it's just a single link of Withering Step. It's basically a phase run, giving us a quick boost to speed, and at the same time giving us phasing to allow us to run through packs, and a bit of spell dodge and attack dodge. As an evasion build, this works perfect, so I highly recommend you to use this skill. On another separate 4-link setup, we have Cast When Damage Taken, linked with Wave of Conviction, and Summon Ice Golem. Now, as you guys may have noticed, Cast When Damage Taken is actually left at level 1. Reason being, the lower level of Cast When Damage Taken, the less amount of damage you have to take in order to proc the spells linked to it. We want this to proc as often as possible, lowering the enemy's resistance by -25 when Wave of Conviction procs. A very cool setup. Now, for this to work, keep in mind that Cast When Damage Taken gem's requirement level has to be the same as its linked spells. For example, at level 1, Cast When Damage Taken requires level 38, so that means Summon Ice Golem can only be leveled up to level 3, because it also requires level 38, which gives us a bit of accuracy and global increased critical strike chance, and Wave of Conviction can only be up to level 7, because it requires level 37. If you level up Summon Ice Golem or Wave of Conviction anymore, it will no longer work because the requirement level is higher than the Cast When Damage Taken gem. And for the last socket, we have Blink Arrow. Blink Arrow is basically the bow's only movement skill, and it's actually very, very cool. Now, while it does have a cooldown, it lets you blink to a very far side of your current screen, or I guess you can say map, and it's essentially what you get to use to get out of sticky situations. Highly recommended, so at least keep one into your force socket. For our third and final 4-link, we have a nice utility setup featuring Ensaring Arrow. Now, not only does Ensaring Arrow actually reduce the enemy's movement speed, but it also makes them take 20% increased projectile attack damage, which essentially is a more multiplier. However, for Ensaring Arrow to work, the arrow has to stop at the same location as the monster you intend to ensnare. Meaning, if you have Pierce and the arrow actually pierces through the enemy, it will not stop at the monster's location, thus it will not ensnare. This is also partially true for Chain. Since Chain causes the arrow to bounce off the target, it will not actually ensnare the target you intend to ensnare. However, this is kind of a viable trade-off, because if there's only one enemy in the location you're fighting, then you're fine, as the arrow will not bounce and you will still keep ensnaring the enemy. Now, linked with Ensaring Arrow, we have Curse on Hit, Projectile Weakness, and Mirage Archer. This is actually a very cool setup, because as we ensnare our enemies, increases the damage they take and reducing their movement speed. We are also cursing them with Projectile Weakness, which makes them take more damage as well. Another cool more damage multiplier. Now, we link it with Mirage Archer because Ensnaring Arrow's reduced movement speed does stack 3 times, so we want to automate it as much as possible. So the minute we ensnare them with 1 arrow, Mirage Archer continues to stack until we hit the maximum of 3 stacks automatically. Now, remember when I said about Blast Rain, if you cannot get 5 off colors, then you have to swap out Combustion for Sword Projectiles? Here's the opportunity where you can actually link Combustion into your Ensnaring Arrow. Unfortunately, you would have to drop Mirage Archer in the automation process, but you can just link Combustion here, as Ensnaring Arrow is actually converted to fire, well, half of it anyway, due to Signal Fire, so there's a good chance that Ensnaring Arrow will actually ignite the enemy. But this, now you actually have the debuff, and you get the benefit of the 19- fire resistance along with the damage from sword projectiles. However, it's not as reliable, but it is an option if you can until you get the 5 off collar. Otherwise, if you guys decide to use Belly of the Beast instead of Comb's Heart from my recommendation list for your body armor, then I recommend socketing in Artillery Ballista. It works very similar to Blast Rain, and it can help you automate the combustion debuff, which lowers your enemy's resistance by 19% fire, which is absolutely awesome, and which allows you to take slower projectiles into your Blast Rain and as well keep the Mirage Archer in your helmet. Now the other following links for Artillery Ballista are Immolate for that added fire, elemental damage of attacks, concentrated effect, and inspiration. For your bandit choices, I only recommend either a Lyra or kill all bandits. If you pick up a Lyra, you get a bit of crit multi, which is really good since we are a critical strike chance build, a decent amount of resistances, 15 to all res, which is very good as well because the build has very scarce elemental resistances, and a bit of mana regen, which is very good early on when you really need that mana regen. Otherwise, if you decide to go for the 2 passive points, just put them on for a jewel socket on the tree and you're good to go. Those are my only 2 recommendations. Now with the bulk of the character out of the way, it's time to talk about the Pantheon. Now the Pantheon isn't too important, but if you guys want my recommendation, I highly recommend either Solvar or Kali for that reduced damage taken over time and an increased recovery rate if you stop taking damage over time recently, which is really good for the Awakener, or Soulsul of Lunaris for increased movement speed and physical damage reduction when enemies are nearby. It also has avoid projectiles that have chains and a bit of dodge chance if you've been hit recently. It's very good since the build is evasion based. For your minor god, there's only 2 things I actually recommend. Either Soul for Slotha to get more life flask uptime. This is really good against the Awakener, and for the fact that we are Vault Pack, so we have no life regen, the more life flask we can have, the better. So it's actually a very good Pantheon and what I recommend first. Secondly, for the other minor god is Soul of Garukan. It gives you a chance to evade if you've taken a savage hit recently, but its main noteworthy mod is that you increase movement speed if you haven't been hit recently. Is up the majority of the time since we are evasion, so it's good for clear speed and to walk around a little faster. Now before you guys start leveling this build, I highly recommend going to the description below and copying the paste bin link for your POB. As you guys open it, you're going to see that there's a little thing on the bottom left that allows you to change the tree. As you guys can see here, there's early game, mid game, and end game. Essentially at what point in the game, what node to take and you want to prioritize. While I know I covered this already in the passive tree earlier on, I want to give you guys something you can follow very easily in the POB as well. So I hope that helps you guys in deciding what nodes to pick up early on. Now for the most common leveling uniques I can offer to you guys is of course Tabula Rasa for a cheap 6 link. Lochanio Cuirass, easily for your gloves, it gives you a lot of attack speed and cast speed and usable level 1. Wanderlust for increased movement speed at level 1. Gold Rim for a lot more resistances, and then for your belt you can of course use a Worm's Molt at level 8 for that strength and intelligence, and then upgrade it later to a Prism Weave for all the damage. For your amulet, there's of course the Jade Amulet Kurui's Ward for increased movement speed and projectile damage. It gives a bit of strength as well. For your rings, just pick up anything. Essentially a Black Heart ring will work, but eventually you want to upgrade into a Praxis Power Ring early on at level 22 because it's absolutely amazing for your mana. It actually reduces the mana cost of your skills between 4 to 8. Highly recommend you get a -8 one, and allows you basically to level through the game without having to use a mana flask. Highly recommend. Now for your quiver, I recommend just picking up anything early on in the game until you reach level 22 and you can use your Black Gleam and then eventually upgrade it to your Signal Fire. For your leveling weapons, you want to start with a Silver Branch at level 1, then upgrade to a Roth's Reach at level 18, and then a Depth Harp at level 32. A Depth Harp should carry you all the way to level 62 in order to get your Chin Soul, which is your endgame bow. However, there is a Depth Opus along the way, but it's more expensive than your endgame bow, so I highly do not recommend you to buy that. Unless you already have it, then go ahead and use it. Well, that pretty much wraps up the entire character. I apologize for the super long video, but I want to give you guys as much answers and details about the build as possible. That way, there isn't that many questions at the end of the video. Or at least that's my goal. Hopefully. But of course, if you do have any questions, go ahead, post them in the YouTube comments down below, and I'll do my best to answer them as quick as possible. Again, I apologize for the delay. I'm trying to give you guys all the information as possible, but at the end of the day, thank you guys so much for watching and all the support. This build is actually an absolute blast, and it killed everything at a decent budget. For that very reason, I'm super excited to show it off to you guys. But I think my job here is done, so I'm gonna catch you guys in the next video. Cool idea coming up soon.